I think this is the heaviest one yet.
Let me get that. We are almost done.
This neighborhood has strict covenants. You can't just leave your belongings on the lawn.
I told you this would happen if we didn't address this immediately.
Evening, folks. We received a call about a disturbance.
It seems the court disagrees with your interpretation of the bylaws. This injunction means you are to cease all contact immediately.
My goodness.
We've confirmed the alibi. All charges are being dropped.
Oh, thank you. I don't know what we would have done.
I remember that day like it was yesterday. It was a normal Saturday morning. The sky was clear. The air felt fresh. I had just finished my coffee. I was excited, but also nervous. It wasn't just any day. It was the day my wife would finally move into our home. We had been married for 2 years. She lived in another city because her job kept her there. We talked every day. We visited when we could. We saved money for months. We planned everything carefully. This house was supposed to be the start of our new life. We had signed all the papers. We had paid the fees. We had updated our address with the city. Everything was legal. Everything was in order, or so we thought. The HOA had always been a little annoying, but we never had a real problem. They sent letters about lawn height. They sent reminders about trash day. They asked us to keep the driveway clean. It was annoying, but we dealt with it. My wife was moving in with a small truck, just a few boxes, a few pieces of furniture. Nothing big. We were trying to keep it simple. We wanted to avoid any drama. I stood outside the house when the truck arrived. I felt my heart beating fast. I was happy. I was proud. I wanted her to feel welcomed. I wanted her to feel safe. She stepped out of the truck with a smile. She had a few boxes in her hands. She looked tired, but she was excited. She walked toward the door. She turned around and looked at me. "I'm home," she said, and I felt something inside me relax. Like a weight was lifted. I walked toward her. I hugged her. I could feel her shaking a little. She had been through a long move. She had traveled a long distance. She had been worried about everything. I said, "It's okay. We are safe here." She smiled. She looked at the house. She looked at the street. She looked at the neighbors. Everything seemed normal. Everything seemed quiet. Then, suddenly, a car pulled up. It wasn't a neighbor. It wasn't a delivery truck. It was a car with an HOA logo on the side. I didn't recognize the logo at first, but then I saw the woman inside. It was the HOA lady, the one who always had that sharp look, the one who always seemed angry, the one who always acted like she owned the neighborhood. She stepped out of the car. She was holding a clipboard. She walked toward us with a serious face. She looked at my wife. Then she looked at me. "Excuse me," she said. "Who is she?" I felt my stomach drop. I said, "This is my wife. She is moving in today." The HOA lady stared at my wife like she was a problem, like she was a mistake, like she didn't belong. She said, "She's not allowed to live here." I felt my jaw tighten. I said, "What do you mean?" "She's my wife." The HOA lady didn't answer. She just stared. She looked like she was waiting for me to say something else, like she was ready to win an argument. Then she said, "You didn't update the records. The board doesn't know she is here." I said, "We updated everything. We signed everything. We paid everything." She shook her head. She said, "You need to follow the rules." I felt my blood start to boil. I said, "We follow the rules. This is our home." She took a step closer. Her eyes were sharp. Her voice was cold. She said, "You need to leave. She needs to leave." My wife was holding a box. She looked at me. She looked scared. She didn't say anything. She just held the box tighter. I could see the fear in her eyes. I could see the pain. I said, "No, she is staying." The HOA lady stared at me like I was crazy. She said, "You don't understand. This is not a personal matter. This is a rule." I said, "Then show me the rule." She looked at her clipboard. She said, "The rule is clear. Only registered residents can live here. You are not registered." I felt my heart racing. I said, "We are registered. We submitted everything." She looked at me with a smug smile. She said, "You didn't submit the right form." I was confused. I said, "What form?" She said, "The form for new residents." I said, "We didn't know we needed a form. We did everything the HOA asked." She said, "You should have known." My wife stepped forward. She said, "I am not leaving. This is my home." The HOA lady looked at her. She said, "You are not a resident. You are not allowed here." My wife said, "I am married to him." The HOA lady said, "That doesn't matter." I could feel my anger rising. I felt my wife's fear rising too. I could see that the HOA lady was enjoying this. I could see that she felt powerful. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a siren. I looked up. I saw a police car turning into our street. My heart sank. I didn't understand. Why were the police coming? What did the HOA do? The police car pulled up. 2 officers stepped out. They walked toward us. I could see their faces. They looked serious. They looked like they expected trouble. The HOA lady pointed at my wife. She said, "They're not allowed to live here." The officers looked at me. They looked at my wife. They asked, "Is there a problem?" I said, "No. My wife is moving in." One officer looked at the HOA lady. He asked, "Did she call 911?" She nodded. She said, "Yes." She called because there is an unauthorized person living here. The officer turned to me. He said, "We got a call about a possible trespasser." I felt my face turn red. I said, "She is not a trespasser. She is my wife." The officer looked at the HOA lady. He asked, "Do you have proof she is not allowed?" The HOA lady looked at her clipboard. She said, "Yes, she is not registered." The officer looked at me. He said, "Do you have proof she is allowed?" I didn't know what to say. I felt my wife's hand in mine. She was shaking. The officer said, "We need to clear this up. Please step aside." They asked my wife to step aside. They asked me to step aside. The HOA lady watched us like she was watching a show. I felt helpless. I felt angry. I felt embarrassed. I felt like my home was being attacked. My wife looked at me. She whispered, "I'm sorry." I said, "Don't apologize. This is not your fault." The officers asked for our IDs. They asked for the house papers. They asked for proof of ownership. I handed them everything. The officers looked at the papers. They looked at the HOA lady. They looked at us. Then the officer said, "We will need to call the HOA president." I felt my heart drop. I said, "Do that? But this is ridiculous." The HOA lady smiled. She looked satisfied. She looked like she had won. I could see my wife's fear turning into anger. She was quiet, but her eyes were sharp. She looked at the HOA lady. She said, "You shouldn't have done this." The HOA lady said, "I followed the rules." My wife said, "You followed your own rules." The HOA lady didn't like that. She looked furious. She said, "I'm the one in charge here." My wife said, "Not for long." I didn't understand what she meant, but I could see something change in her face. She looked calm. She looked confident. She looked like she had a plan. I didn't know what she was going to do, but I knew one thing. This was not going to end like this. The police officers called the HOA president. They spoke for a few minutes. I couldn't hear everything, but I could hear the tension in the officer's voice. The officer looked at the HOA lady and said, "You need to stop this. This is not a police matter." The HOA lady argued. She said something like, "He is breaking the rules." The officer said, "Rules are not enforced by police unless there is a crime." The HOA lady looked frustrated. She said, "But she is not allowed." The officer said, "Then you take it to court. You don't call the police." I could see the HOA lady's face. It was red. It was angry. She looked like she wanted to explode. She looked like she was losing control. Then the officer turned to us. He said, "We will stay here until the situation is clear." I said, "We didn't do anything wrong." The officer said, "I understand, but we need to make sure everyone is safe." My wife looked at me. She whispered, "I'm scared." I held her hand. I said, "I'm here. I'm not letting them win." The HOA lady walked away for a moment. She went back to her car. She was talking on the phone. I could see her angry face. I could see her shaking. She came back. She said, "I'm calling the board." The officer said, "You can call them, but this is not a crime." The HOA lady said, "I will make sure she leaves." The officer said, "You cannot force her to leave." The HOA lady looked like she wanted to argue more, but she didn't. She just stared at us. She looked like she was waiting for something. I could feel the tension rising. I could feel the fear. I could feel my heart pounding. Then my wife said something that surprised me. She said, "I have something to show you." The HOA lady looked at her. She looked confused. She said, "What is it?" My wife reached into her bag. She pulled out a thick folder. She held it up. She said, "These are legal papers." The HOA lady looked shocked. She said, "What is that?" My wife said, "These are eviction papers." The HOA lady's face changed. She looked scared for the first time. She looked like she didn't know what to do. The officer looked at my wife. He said, "Eviction papers? Who are you evicting?" My wife said, "The HOA, specifically the fake board member." The officer looked confused. He asked, "What do you mean fake?" My wife said, "She is not a real board member. She has been pretending to be one. She has been collecting fees. She has been threatening residents." The officer looked at the HOA lady. He asked, "Is this true?" The HOA lady looked at her clipboard. She said, "I'm the HOA president." My wife said, "No, you are not." The officer said, "We need to see the HOA documents." My wife handed the folder to the officer. The officer opened it. He looked at the papers. He read the names. He looked at the signatures. He looked up. He said, "This is serious." The HOA lady said, "This is not real." The officer said, "These are official papers." The HOA lady said, "You can't do this." The officer said, "You are not a board member. You are not authorized to enforce rules." The HOA lady's face turned pale. She looked like she was about to cry. My wife looked at her calmly. She said, "You have been abusing your power. You have been threatening people. You have been lying." The HOA lady looked like she wanted to run away. She looked like she wanted to hide. The officer said, "We will need to contact the real HOA president." The HOA lady said, "There is no real president." The officer said, "Then you are not allowed to represent the HOA." The HOA lady looked at me. She said, "You don't understand. This is my neighborhood." My wife said, "No, it's our home." I could feel my anger rising again. I wanted to shout. I wanted to fight, but I stayed calm. I stayed quiet. I knew my wife was handling this. The officer said, "We will stay here until this is resolved." The HOA lady looked like she was defeated. She looked like she was losing. Then she said something that surprised me. She said, "You can't do this to me." My wife said, "I already did." The HOA lady turned and walked away. She got into her car. She drove off. I felt a rush of relief. I felt my body relax. I looked at my wife. She looked tired. She looked emotional. She looked like she had been holding something inside for a long time. She said, "I knew she was fake." I said, "How did you know?" She said, "Because I did my research. Before moving in, I checked the HOA records. I found her name. It wasn't on the official list, but she was acting like she owned the place." I said, "Why didn't you tell me?" She said, "I didn't want to scare you. I wanted to make sure everything was ready." I felt ashamed. I said, "I should have known." She said, "No, you did nothing wrong." She was the one who lied. I looked at the house. I looked at the street. I looked at the neighborhood. I felt a strange feeling, like we were not alone. I realized that the HOA had been controlling this place for a long time. They had been using fear. They had been using rules. They had been using intimidation. But my wife had found the truth, and the truth was powerful. After the HOA lady left, the officers stayed for a while. They spoke to us. They asked questions. They wrote notes. They looked at the papers again. They looked at the house. They looked at the neighborhood. One officer said, "You should be careful. People like her can be dangerous." I said, "We know." The officer said, "We will follow up with the HOA. We will make sure this is handled properly." My wife said, "Thank you." The officer said, "You are welcome, but you need to make sure you are safe." We thanked the officers. They left. The neighborhood went quiet again. The street returned to normal. But our lives had changed. My wife and I stood in the driveway. We looked at each other. We didn't know what to say. We were both emotional. We were both tired. She said, "I didn't want to be like this." I said, "Neither did I." She said, "I just wanted to move in." I said, "I know." We hugged. We held each other. We didn't say anything for a while. We just stood there. Then my wife said, "We need to be ready." I said, "Ready for what?" She said, "For them. They will come back." I felt my heart sink. I said, "Who?" She said, "The HOA, the fake board member. They will not give up." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because they want control. They want power. They want money." I looked at her. I said, "We need to fight back." She said, "We already did." I said, "But we need to make sure they can't do this to anyone else." She nodded. She said, "Yes." We went inside the house. We started unpacking. We tried to act normal. We tried to act like nothing happened. But everything felt different. The house felt different. The air felt different. The walls felt like they had eyes. We unpacked the boxes. We set up the bedroom. We set up the kitchen. We tried to make it feel like home. But my mind kept going back to the HOA, to the fake board member, to the police, to the fear. My wife sat down at the kitchen table. She opened her laptop. She started searching. I asked, "What are you doing?" She said, "I'm looking for the real HOA records." I said, "We already have the papers." She said, "Yes, but we need more. We need proof. We need evidence." I said, "Evidence of what?" She said, "Of their fraud, of their lies, of their illegal actions." I sat down beside her. I looked at the screen. I saw the HOA website. I saw the list of board members. I saw the contact information. But something was missing. The HOA lady's name was not there. The fake board member's name was not there. I said, "She's not on the list." My wife said, "Exactly." I said, "So how is she doing this?" My wife said, "She is using fear. She is using intimidation. She is using lies." I said, "We need to expose her." My wife nodded. She said, "Yes, we need to expose her and the people who support her." I said, "Who supports her?" She said, "The neighbors who are too afraid to speak up." I felt a chill. I realized that this wasn't just one person. It was a system. It was a network. It was a group of people who wanted control. I said, "We need to find other victims." My wife said, "Yes." We spent the next few days talking to neighbors. We walked around the street. We talked to people at the grocery store. We talked to people at the park. At first, no one wanted to talk. They looked scared. They looked nervous. They looked like they were afraid of being targeted. But slowly, people started to open up. One neighbor said, "She threatened me." Another said, "She told me I had to pay extra fees." Another said, "She said she could evict me if I didn't do what she said." We realized that this was not just a problem. This was a pattern. The fake board member had been doing this for years. She had been using the HOA to bully people. She had been using the HOA to collect money. She had been using the HOA to control the neighborhood. My wife said, "We need to gather all the stories." I said, "Yes." We started collecting evidence. We recorded conversations. We took pictures of letters. We saved emails. We wrote down dates and names. We built a file. We built a case. We were not just defending ourselves. We were preparing for a fight. A few days later, we received a letter. It was from the HOA. It was written in a harsh tone. It said that my wife was not allowed to live here. It said that we were violating the rules. It said that we needed to leave. My wife looked at the letter. She smiled. She said, "They are getting desperate." I said, "What are you going to do?" She said, "I'm going to serve them." I said, "Serve them what?" She said, "Eviction papers." I felt my heart stop. I said, "Are you sure?" She said, "Yes." She looked at me. She said, "This is not just about us. This is about everyone." I said, "Okay." We went to the lawyer. We talked to him. We showed him the evidence. We showed him the fake board members' actions. We showed him the letters. We showed him the threats. The lawyer said, "You have a strong case." My wife said, "We need to expose them." The lawyer said, "Yes, but we need to do it the right way." He explained the process. He explained the legal steps. He explained the risks. But we were ready. We had been through too much to back down now. We left the lawyer's office. We felt a new sense of purpose. We felt like we were not alone. We felt like we were finally fighting back. The day we served the papers, I felt nervous. My wife felt nervous too, but she looked calm. She looked focused. She looked like she knew what she was doing. We drove to the HOA office. It was a small building. It looked normal. It looked harmless. But we knew what was inside. We knew what had been happening. We walked inside. The air felt heavy. The receptionist looked up. She looked surprised to see us. My wife said, "We need to speak to the board." The receptionist said, "The board is not here." My wife said, "We have papers for them." The receptionist looked nervous. She said, "You can leave them here." My wife said, "No, I want them delivered in person." The receptionist hesitated. She looked like she wanted to refuse, but she didn't. She led us to a small meeting room. We waited. We sat down. My wife held the folder. She held it tightly. After a few minutes, the door opened. The HOA lady walked in. She looked shocked. She looked angry. She looked like she didn't know what to do. She said, "What is this?" My wife said, "These are eviction papers." The HOA lady said, "You can't do this." My wife said, "Yes, I can." The HOA lady said, "You don't understand. I am the HOA." My wife said, "No, you are not." The HOA lady looked like she wanted to shout, but she didn't. She looked at the papers. She saw the evidence. She saw the names. She saw the truth. She said, "This is not real." My wife said, "It is real." The HOA lady looked at the board members. She looked at the people in the room. She looked like she was searching for support. But no one spoke. No one defended her. The room was silent. My wife said, "You have been lying. You have been threatening people. You have been collecting fees illegally." The HOA lady's face turned pale. She said, "You don't know what you're talking about." My wife said, "I do, and I have proof." She opened the folder. She showed the papers. She showed the signatures. She showed the records. The HOA lady looked at the papers. She looked like she was about to cry. She said, "This is not fair." My wife said, "It's fair. It's the truth." The HOA lady said, "You will regret this." My wife said, "No, you will regret this." The HOA lady stood up. She walked out of the room. She slammed the door. We waited for a moment. Then we heard the sound of a car leaving. We knew she was gone. My wife looked at me. She said, "It's done." I said, "What happens now?" She said, "Now we wait." We left the HOA office. We drove home. We felt a strange mix of relief and fear. We felt like we had won. But we also knew the fight was not over. That night, we heard a knock on the door. We opened it. It was a neighbor. He looked nervous. He said, "I heard what happened." I said, "Yes." He said, "I'm sorry. I didn't know she was doing this." My wife said, "It's okay. You are not the problem." He said, "I'm scared." I said, "Why?" He said, because she threatened me. She said she would make my life difficult. If I spoke up, my wife said, "You are not alone." He said, "I want to help." My wife said, "Thank you." We talked for a while. He told us about other neighbors. He told us about the threats. He told us about the fees. He told us about the fear. We realized that we had opened a door. We had given people hope. We had shown them that they were not alone. The next day, more neighbors came forward. More stories. More evidence. More proof. The fake board member was not a single villain. She was part of a system built on fear. The HOA was exposed. The truth was out. And the neighborhood started to change. The legal process began. It was slow. It was stressful. It was tiring. But we stayed strong. Our lawyer filed the case. He submitted the evidence. He prepared the documents. He explained everything to us. The HOA responded. They tried to fight back. They tried to deny everything. They tried to intimidate us. But we had the truth. The fake board member hired a lawyer. She tried to act like she was innocent. She tried to act like she was a victim. But the evidence was too strong. The court date came. We were nervous. My wife looked calm. She looked ready. We walked into the courtroom. The air was cold. The room was quiet. The judge looked serious. The HOA lawyer spoke first. He tried to argue that the HOA had the right to enforce rules. He tried to say that my wife was not allowed to live there. Our lawyer stood up. He spoke clearly. He showed the evidence. He showed the records. He showed the lies. The judge listened. The judge looked at the papers. The judge asked questions. The fake board member looked nervous. She looked like she was losing. The judge said, "The HOA is not a private company. It is a community organization. It must follow the law." The judge looked at the fake board member. He said, "You are not a board member. You have no authority." The fake board member looked like she wanted to disappear. The judge continued, "Your actions are illegal. You have been abusing your power." The judge looked at us. He said, "The homeowners have the right to live in their homes. They cannot be threatened by fake rules." The judge ruled in our favor. He ordered the HOA to stop the harassment. He ordered the fake board member to step down. He ordered the HOA to update the records. My wife and I felt a wave of relief. We felt like a heavy weight was lifted. We looked at each other. We hugged. We cried. We had won. But the victory was not just for us. It was for the whole neighborhood. People started to speak up. People started to feel safe again. People started to feel like they had rights. The fake board member moved away. She left the neighborhood. She never returned. The HOA changed. The real board members took control. They updated the records. They fixed the problems. The neighborhood felt different. It felt peaceful. My wife and I finally felt like we belonged. We finally felt like we were home. Months passed. Life returned to normal. But we never forgot what happened. We still talked about it. We still remembered the fear. We still remembered the moment the police arrived. We still remember the moment we served the papers. But we also remember the victory. We remembered the truth. We remembered the strength. My wife and I built our life here. We made friends. We helped neighbors. We supported each other. The neighborhood became a real community. People started to trust each other again. People started to help each other. We were proud. We were grateful. One day, we walked down the street. We saw a new family moving in. They looked nervous. They looked scared. My wife smiled. She walked over. She introduced herself. She offered help. The family looked relieved. They thanked us. My wife said, "Don't worry. You are safe here." The family smiled. They said, "Thank you." We walked away. We felt proud. We felt like we had made a difference. We had faced fear. We had faced power. We had faced lies. And we had won. The HOA was no longer a weapon. It was a community. The fake board member was gone. The truth was out. And the day my wife moved and became the day we took back our home, we learned a lesson. Never let someone else control your life with fear. Never let someone else define your home. And never underestimate the power of the truth.